We are back with another episode of App Stories. Today's show is brought to you by Concepts and SourceGraph. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico. How you doing?
Hello, John. Hello, how are you?
I'm doing really well. All moved into North Carolina during the pre-show for App Stories Plus subscribers. We talked a little bit about that, some of the technical stuff around what it means to move in the United States and all the hassles, but I'm glad for it. And we also talked about what you are doing for your review this year for your setup in terms of Obsidian and research and other apps that you're using and that I'm using for my macOS review.
Yeah, and we wanted to talk about even more research stuff because that wasn't enough.
No, it was not nearly enough. That was what we're using. But I thought, it'd be cool for us to talk a little bit more about some of the reading and research apps that we use, both that we're using for things like the annual reviews that we do, but that we use throughout the year, and ones that maybe we don't use, but we also like. I mean, just ones that we've tried in the past and that we can recommend to people.
Yeah, and I feel like I wanted to start with the reading apps because I feel like that's the one market that has really taken off again lately. I don't know why. You wrote about this, I think 6 months ago at the end of 2021 in the club. It's this market for sort of read it later apps is hot again. I guess there are startups that are trying to reinvent this space. There are investors pouring their money into these companies. And there are some really fascinating new entries in the reading space.
Yeah, there really are, and it's a little odd to me that this is hot all of a sudden again. I chalk a lot of it up to the resurgence in email newsletters. That had a lot to do with it. You had things like Substack, which was doing its own app that had Substack newsletters in it, but then they also threw RSS in there, and I think it just newsletters started clogging people's inboxes, and people were decided, well, there's got to be a better way to read these email newsletters than in an email client. So why don't we revisit reading apps, bring in the email newsletters, which is something that a lot of them were already kind of doing anyway. And so we've seen new mix-ups of a lot of the way these apps are designed. We've got things like Matter. Readwise is working on their secret project for their Read Later app, and a whole bunch of others. So we should dive into these.
Yeah. Some problems are so cyclical, they always come back, and we've seen this with streaming. We've seen it with podcasts, and this is the kind of problem that keeps popping up every few years. The first app I want to mention, I think, is Matter. Now, Matter, unfortunately, has the same name as the upcoming Home Standard.
Yeah, it's not great. I had this.
I wonder if they're gonna change their name.
I had this problem the other day when I was writing about Matter, the open the consortium, and I thought, people are going to think this is the app, or if I'm writing about the app, people are going to think this is the other. Yeah, it's not a great name as a result.
Yeah. Anyway, Matter, the Read Later app. We mentioned a bunch of times on Mac Stories. I wrote shortcuts for club members to take advantage of the Matter API. And a good way to think about Matter is it's a Read Later app that has a fantastic text parser. In fact, I think it's probably one of the, if not the best at the moment. It's up there with Apple's own Safari Reader text parser in terms of quality and performance, I think. But in addition to that, it also has an audio component as well as integration with modern PKM, personal knowledge management apps like Obsidian and Notion. So it's trying to cover, if you will, multiple areas of functionality. The text parser is excellent. You save articles to Matter, and you can choose to read them in a text-only, sort of clutter-free view that only shows you text and images from the story. Of course, you can also switch to a web view, or you can copy the URL of an article and open it in a browser or something. You can also listen to articles. This is something that we covered before on App Stories. An excellent feature of Matter is this text-to-speech engine that they have. And I think it's the most natural sounding text to speech conversion engine that I've seen in this kind of utility, in this kind of apps. I don't know exactly what API they're using. Maybe it's one of the Microsoft ones. Maybe it's one of the Amazon ones. I'm not sure. But these articles that you listen to in Matter, they sound pretty great. I mean, it's a robot for sure. Like, it's not an actual human reading the story, but it sounds good enough, I think, to make it an enjoyable experience. So the idea is you can open Matter and you can read articles, or if you're driving, you're commuting, you're taking a walk or something, you can choose to listen to an article instead. That's one of the advantages of using Matter. And the other, as I mentioned, is you have integration with apps like Notion and Obsidian. And specifically for Obsidian, there's an official plugin. There's an official Matter plugin that automatically imports all your notes and highlights from Matter into Obsidian. Highlights is the other big feature of Matter in this new generation of reading apps, meaning you can highlight anything you want when you're reading a story. You can add a note to your highlight, and at any point, you can see a summary of all the highlights that you've saved in a particular article. That, in fact, I think is one of my favorite touches of Matter, because from the main queue or from the archive, you can tap an icon that shows you a list of all the highlights from the story without actually opening the story. It's just a pop-up with a preview of all the highlights that you've saved in an article. Then, of course, you can tap on an individual highlight, and that'll take you to that specific point in the story to show you exactly what you highlighted. So that's very well done. It's one of my favorite features in the app. And also they have a web client now. It's not the most innovative web client. I think actually the folks at Craft are doing more interesting things in bringing what used to be a native app to the web, but it's functional and it's got all the things you could want from a web client for Matter. And there's also other small touches that I appreciate before I move on to the things that I do not like. For example, they have this genius shortcut for moving an article to the top of your list. It's called Send to Top, and you can just swipe left to right in your queue and say, this article, actually make it float to the top again. That's a very nice way to maybe prioritize things in your read later list for later, for reading it, when you have time. And also, speaking of the queue, they have these multiple filters and sorting options. So you can do things like show me the articles that are in progress. So maybe you've started reading multiple things and now you want to make sure you finish them. There's a way to do that. Or you can sort by length. You can sort by creation date. You have all these different ways to tackle your queue, which is something that not a lot of read later apps do. And that's I know, John, that you also wanted to mention something that a few things that they do on Mac OS, and also they recently rolled out integration with RSS.
Right. Before we get to the cons, I do want to mention those because you mentioned that there is a web client now, and you're right. It's nothing terribly special, but I think that's okay. I think it's good that there is a web option available for anybody who wants it, because sometimes you're just in that context of using your browser and you want to grab an article or see your highlights or look at a story. But I'm not convinced that most people do their reading in a web browser or necessarily even want to. I think a dedicated native app is a better solution. And I think that Matter's done a good job with that with their iOS and iPadOS apps. Now, but if you are on your browser and if you are saving things, there is a really nice Matter extension, Safari extension, that sits up in your toolbar. And when you click on it, you have the option to either save it or view it immediately, that article in their, through their parser, or go to that web app that we mentioned. So there are three options. And what I like about it a lot is not just that there are those three different options, but that there are keyboard shortcuts tied to them. So Command M saves an article straight to my Matter queue. And so I use that all the time, all day long. Really nice way to quickly save things. The RSS integration is interesting to me. And I don't think it's for me, but I also have come to the realization that I don't think I'm a very typical RSS reader because I subscribe to a high volume of RSS feeds, and I am a skimmer. I skim headlines looking for interesting things for Mac stories more than anything else. I have a separate RSS client that I use for things that are more like for fun reading, whether it's reviews of video games or TV or movies, that kind of thing. But when I'm in Reader by Silvio Rizzi, I am in there to go through a lot of articles very quickly, whether they're about Apple or other technology topics, and put them somewhere for later. So I don't think that would work in a read later app like Matter because it would just overwhelm the inbox. And what Matter's done, I think, kind of realizing that, importing maybe 200 RSS feeds using OPML is probably not a perfect solution for a read later app. They have instead allowed you to add feeds one by one. And I think that that's a good compromise because if there is a particular site where you really want to read everything that's published, and I think that this works particularly well with lower volume sites, of course, you can do that. You can just add 1, 2, 3, 4 feeds. It's very much like subscribing to an email newsletter. You have an email newsletter and you've subscribed to it because presumably you want to read it more often than not. And the volume is probably similar. It's probably not coming out, multiple times a day, maybe once a day, maybe once a week. So I think that that's an okay approach for RSS. I just don't think that it's one that I'm going to probably use with Matter going forward. And I guess finally, another nice thing that I would mention that I know a lot of people use with other apps like Instapaper is Kindle support. You can have your Matter articles sent to your Kindle. Works very much like it does with other apps. But if that's how you like to read things you've saved, it's a great option with Matter as well.
Very nice. Yeah. You mentioned there's a few cons that we need to cover here.
There are.
I think a lot of them come down to the non-native feel of Matter in a few places. Like, for example, on the iPad, the app is very sad. It's a very poor iPad experience. It doesn't use sidebars at all. It's very limited support for keyboard shortcuts.
Yeah. On a big iPad, I think especially that's an issue. It's a little bit less so on the mini, but yeah, if you're on your iPad Pro, it's a big iPhone app essentially.
Yeah, essentially, yes. Some menu, like all the menus are custom. They're not like native context menus, which is something that I've come to expect from all of the apps that I use on the iPad. They have these custom menus, and some of them, they do not even scroll if you do the 2-finger scroll on your trackpad on the Magic Keyboard.
Yeah.
So it's that's not what I expect when I'm using a modern iPad app. And also like this general sense of non-nativeness to the app, which is like, sometimes it feels kind of strange.
Yeah, I guess when I was talking about the web app and talking about how the Matter is more of a native app, I guess I should clarify that I meant more of a dedicated app, not necessarily a native app, because you're right, the technologies are not standard controls for iOS or iPadOS.
Yeah. For example, you don't have any context menus in the queue. Like I was testing Matter again today before recording the show, and I tried to right-click an article in the main queue, and it did nothing. Whereas in a modern iPad experience, I would expect to right-click and get a context menu. Mm-hmm. And also, I gotta say, the application icon is horrible.
It looks like a little kid drew it.
It's. I'm sorry if that's your logo, but it's a very sad icon, and I struggle to find a good place for it on my home screen because it's just a black thing with a white shape on top of it. So maybe there could be a nicer way to design an application icon for Matter. This company, they don't have a business plan at the moment. That's a big concern of mine when it comes to Matter. They are a startup that received venture capitalist money. They don't have any way to make money from the product itself, it seems. There's no subscription. There's no way to give your money to the company to get features or extras or whatever. So that's usually, a concern if you're the type of person who says, I don't want to commit to a product if it's going to get acquired and shut down by someone else in 6 months or a year or something. And also I would mention, because it's a the text parser is so good, but it's unfortunate that they have kind of limited appearance settings. There's not a ton of different fonts you can use, not a lot of themes to choose from. And in general, I think we've seen deeper appearance settings in other apps. So I would like to see more options there to customize the article viewer, to customize themes, and have more fonts and controls for spacing, size, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think the options they have are good ones, but you're right, there aren't very many of them. So if they're not to your taste, then you're not going to like them. The other thing I'd mention, Federico, is the lack of shortcut support. There is a shortcuts action to get articles into Matter, but there's nothing to get things out of it. And to me, that's kind of a red flag, because that means it's an app designed to keep you in that app and to keep your data in that app. Yes, they have a way for you to export all of your saved articles in the settings, but that's one of those, data dump type of solutions that comes to you in an email. I'd like to have better shortcut support for getting URLs out, for getting highlights out with references, all that kind of stuff. So I can use what I'm doing in this app in another place, whether it's now, you mentioned that there's an Obsidian plugin, and that gets you part of the way there. But if you're not an Obsidian user, that's not going to help you. It'd be nice if you could export, for instance, an article's highlights as a markdown file and import it to any other text editor that you want, whether it's like iWriter or Bear or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, I really hope that that's something that they can change in the future, especially when it comes to retrieving content, searching for content, opening stuff in Meta. Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done there for sure.
This episode of App Stories and our entire OS Summer Preview series is brought to you by Concepts. Sketch, explore, and share endless ideas with Concepts' Infinite Canvas for iPad. Designed for creators of all types, the app is ideal for visual thinking, note-taking, drawing, and professional design. Concept lets you interact with and edit your sketches, helping you think and draw smarter. As everything you draw in the app is a vector, you can move, edit, and organize your sketches after you draw them using natural gestures. Sketch freely with liquid pens, markers, and brushes in designer Copic colors. Create mood boards with images, PDFs, and objects, then draw on top. Design with tools like grids, snap, and real-world measurements to create professional projects. Connect your device to any display for instant whiteboarding with a built-in presentation mode. Concepts is used by designers and illustrators at Apple, Disney, PlayStation, Unity, and other companies globally to sketch, design, and communicate visually. Concept comes free as a basic sketching app with the ability to unlock features with a subscription or one-time purchase. You can learn more today about this terrific app by going to their website, which is concepts.app. Mac Stories readers and listeners of this show can enjoy a special 3-month extended free trial when they sign up for an annual subscription by going to concepts.app/MacStories. Again, that URL to get 3 months of infinite creativity before your build is concepts.app/MacStories. Our thanks to Concepts for their support of the show.
Now, the next app I wanna cover, the next reading app I wanna cover, is not an app, it's Safari. Now, when I mention Safari, obviously I'm referring to Safari Reading List. And as it's a running joke on App Stories, has Apple forgotten about Reading List? And all signs seem to point to yes, that Apple has seemingly forgotten about this built-in feature of Safari, because for yet another year, there's no change to Safari Reading List other than it still exists. Well, actually, I guess there's one new thing, but it's not in Safari itself, it's in Shortcuts.
Right.
There's now an action to open the reading list view of Safari directly from Shortcuts.
Yeah, which
so
is
they
kind
have
of
a
funny.
launcher. They have a launcher for reading list.
I think they're just trolling us with that one, because that's about as minor an update as you could possibly get. But I mean, I'll take it. But there's a lot of other things that could be done.
Yeah. But I had a thought a few days ago. And hear me out here, okay?
All right.
And I know that it sounds kind of wild, but
Okay.
hear me out. I had this thought of like, what if I could use a tab group in Safari as a read later system? So my thought was this. So tab groups, they are very nicely integrated with Safari. For example, you can super quickly move a tab from the general tabs view in Safari into a specific tab group. There's a context menu for that. There's multiple ways to move a tab from one place to a specific tab group. You can use the context menu, you can use drag and drop, and of course you can open a tab directly into the tab group. And obviously changing tab groups in Safari is also very convenient, especially now in iPadOS 16 on the iPad. Because in 16 on the iPad, tab groups are shown in the sidebar. That was true before as well. But in 16, you can expand the tab group in the sidebar to see all the tabs that you have open in a specific tab group. Those tabs are sorted from oldest to newest. Just like in any browser, your oldest tab is on the left,
right,
or at the beginning of the list, and the most recent tab is at the bottom or the right side of the list. And you have, obviously, by using Safari and by using tab groups, you have built-in access to all kinds of Safari technologies that come in handy when it comes to reading articles on the web. You have native access to extensions, you have your content blockers, you have your shortcuts integration, and you have Safari Reader, obviously. Safari Reader with plenty of themes, an excellent text parser, and multiple font options. And you have shortcuts integration. Now in 16, for example, there's a new action to open a specific tab group directly from the home screen or by using Siri, for example. And two other things I want to mention. With tab groups, you can choose to have, you basically have three different view modes. You have the list of tabs in the sidebar on the iPad. You have your regular tabs underneath the address bar. And you have the tab overview mode, which you can access by pressing, Command Option \, I think. And you have basically the grid view for all your tabs. And so if you want to create a read later tab group, you can then enter tab overview, press Command F, and search those tabs by title. So you also have a search feature for your articles saved for later. So you can search by title. And lastly, I don't know how these exactly could be useful, but a change in 16 that I noticed a few days ago is that now tab groups can have their specific sets of favorites. So your favorite bookmarks now behave in two different ways in iOS and iPadOS 16. You can have your general favorites. Those are global favorites that you will see in every tab group. But you can also have favorites that are specific to a tab group. So I don't know how, but maybe you could have some favorites just for your read later tab group.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. And I think that those favorites that are specific to tab groups is Apple kind of skating to where users went with tab groups, because, I think tab groups were originally
workspaces.
Yeah,
basically.
They were really designed initially to be like temporary holding pens for sets of tabs that were related in some way, where you wanted to keep them together, and you didn't want to lose them, but you had to move on to something else, and then you could go back to them. But a lot of people, and I know our friend Mike Hurley has been doing this as well, have set up tab groups that are specific to projects or tasks that they do, and having particular apps or particular websites in those tab groups. And having favorites is a way to allow you to go back to those things that are most important to you in that tab group. Because the thing about tab groups is, because they are just tabs like any other browser tab, you can navigate away from them, and then you may not be on the site that you wanted to be on for that particular task. But if you have a favorite set, you can get back to it more quickly that way.
Yeah, exactly. Now, obviously, while this is an idea, there would be plenty of downsides with using tab groups in Safari for reading articles.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have any sorting options, right? You're just opening tabs. You don't have any sorting. I guess you could sort by title is the only thing you could do. But you couldn't. You wouldn't have all the nice sorting options that we just mentioned in Matter. You wouldn't have those in Safari. You wouldn't have full text search for article content because Safari doesn't have that kind of feature. You wouldn't have highlights. Safari doesn't support highlights. You can switch to Safari Reader, but that's it. You would have Quick Note integration. I guess you could potentially tie this in with Quick Note and have those highlights with Quick Note. Maybe that could be something, but it's not a native highlighting feature of Safari itself. And of course, there are no widgets. There are no widgets for Safari, and there are no shortcuts actions at the moment to retrieve tabs from a specific tab group. As I mentioned before, there's only one action to open a tab group. There are no actions to get content from tab groups in Safari. So, I don't know. I wanted to cover this because Safari reading list is very sad and has been very sad as an experience for a few years now. But with tab groups, now that you have this easier way to access them on the iPad and the specific favorites, these shortcuts actions, I don't know, maybe there's something that can be done there.
I think so.
Maybe a few brave souls out there will try to do this and see what happens.
Well, I'll tell you, Federico, I do something a little bit like this in that I often enter the Safari reading mode just to read something on a website that has a lot of ads or other distractions. So, you could dump those articles throughout the day into a tab group and then go through them and put them in reader mode and read them that way. I mean, I think that aspect of reader is still very powerful, and I use it. I don't know about you, but I use it pretty much every day.
Yeah.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by SourceGraph. So you've hired a brilliant developer. That's great, but now you have to get them onboarded. If your company is growing, onboarding new developers will be a common occurrence, but it's a big undertaking every time. One of the biggest challenges for new hires is to get up to speed with the projects that their new teams are working on. This can be tricky if the code bases that your developers are working on are already large. Thankfully, SourceGraph makes it easy to move fast, even in those big code bases. Developers know that knowledge is most useful when it's findable. Centralization helps with that, but given the fact that most companies store knowledge in at least 2 different locations, how do you make knowledge accessible to all those who need it? As a code intelligence platform, SourceGraph gives developers what they need to drive their own learning over time in different situations. Teams without SourceGraph need to rely on asking colleagues or reviewing out-of-date documentation, which is cumbersome and time-consuming. But with SourceGraph, each developer can search across millions of repositories to find specific code, saving time for themselves and everyone else. So that when questions do come up, you know it's the big stuff that's worthy of the extra time. SourceGraph was created to make developers' lives easier, and today they work with leading companies across every industry, including 3 out of 5 of the top tech companies, plus PayPal, Uber, Plaid, GE, Reddit, and Atlassian. Visit about.sourcegraph.com to learn more. That's about.sourcegraph.com to find out why some of the biggest tech companies in the world use SourceGraph and to see what it can do for yours. Or just click on the link in the show notes to let them know that you heard about them from us. Our thanks to SourceGraph for their support of the show.
Now, before we move on to research apps, I have my very own I can't believe no one is talking about this moment.
I know this app. I've played with it.
Okay, so there's this app that I keep seeing pop up on the App Store whenever I search for Read Later. But nobody basically talks about this. So the app is called Qbox. That's Cubox. Qbox. Now, I think the problem with Qbox is that maybe honestly not part of the problem, not just part of the problem. The main problem with Qbox is that half of its website and half of the documentation, not actually all of the documentation, and some of the menus in settings are in Chinese only.
Right.
I don't know why. I don't know these developers. I cannot find them on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. The website is in Chinese, documentation is in Chinese, but it's like only half of the app has been localized to English. And I would guess that for a user on the American or European App Store, finding this kind of app where some of the menus are in Chinese, like it would be a turn off because you don't understand the language, right? You just don't understand what's it saying. But I want to mention Qbox because it's a very interesting read later app. And they're doing a bunch of things that are super fascinating. They have a really well done article parser. So you can extract text and images from stories like in Matter, like in Safari Reader. It's a pretty solid text parser with the ability to reparse articles if something goes wrong. You can also switch to a web view, and there's like even support for a local snapshot mode, which is like essentially like caching a version of the story as it looks on the web in case it changes later. The reason why I'm going to mention this is that they have a great iPad UI, multiple panels, a sidebar. There's a column on the right side of the screen for your annotations. It looks great. They have, as I mentioned, native support for highlights and annotations, and this is great for folks who want to connect this to Obsidian or something else. And you're gonna like this too, John. I think individual highlights have their own URL scheme, so you can link directly to a highlight. And you can even copy a markdown version of that link to your clipboard.
Nice. So every single highlight has like a unique ID, basically.
Yeah,
right?
Every single highlight has a unique ID. And I don't know, but there's something that can be done there. I'm sure there's some workflow that can be done there. You have full text search. You have support for tagging. But more importantly, you have support for creating smart lists. So you can have these lists that operate on multiple filtering criteria. You can filter by date, by keyword, by tag, by read or unread status. There's multiple options there. And you can create your smart lists. Like, for example, I have one called Annotated Last Week. So like, show me articles that have highlights from the past week. Like you can do that kind of stuff. And even those smart lists, they have their own URL scheme. So you can create launchers for opening a specific smart list in Qbox. They have an excellent quick find interface. You press Command F and you get a quick find pop-up that is similar to the one seen in IA Writer.
Okay.
And it lets you search for anything. It lets you search for articles, by title, by text. It lets you search for sections of the app.
By
so
tag?
It's like
Does it handle tags?
By tag, yeah, I think so. It's like a universal command palette to navigate or find content in Qbox. You can even save you can save articles, but you can also sort of use this as a bookmark manager. And this is where the problem comes in. I think there's even a web API for Qbox. But when I open the documentation link, it's in Chinese. So if anybody knows the developers of Qbox or has a way to contact them or knows whether they have a roadmap or knows whether they're looking for help with localization, I would love to know more because this is one of the more interesting native read later apps that I've seen on the App Store in a while. But I want to understand the backstory of the developers more.
Yeah,
so
there's something.
I just wanted to put this out there because it's really interesting, but I only understand half of it.
Yeah, this is one of those apps that I've revisited a couple of times in the past where I'll come across it again and I'll give it a try and it hasn't stuck. And maybe part of it is the fact that part of it is documented in Chinese. but I think there might have been something else. It sounds like it's a lot easier to get information out of it now than it used to be, perhaps, which is a plus. And I should probably try it again. There are a bunch of apps like these. Like Raindrop is kind of the same way for me, where I've bounced off of Raindrop a couple of different times for various things that just didn't quite click with the way I work. But yeah, this is one I should check out again. It's very interesting. All right, Federico, let's move on to research. I have been using Keep It again, and I go back and forth between a lot of different apps for this kind of thing. I'm not a big fan of the Everything Bucket app, where you dump everything into a particular app and organize it within that app and live within that app. It generally doesn't work for me. And I think, though, you can use those apps that are designed that way in a more limited fashion, which is what I've generally done. I do use DevonThink. I use it for some really long-term archival type of stories, the kind of things that I find on the internet that I know will be very, very hard to find again with Google in the future. Articles that maybe cover some aspect of the iPhone or iPad's history that have a unique perspective or a unique interview or tidbits that really aren't found anywhere else. And I'll save those as web archive files and I'll put them in DevonThink. And they do come in handy from time to time when I'm doing kind of a story where I need to put things in historical context. But Keep It I use for maybe more interim stuff. And I'm looking for ways to maybe use it again more, because it got a really big update about a month ago, maybe a little more than a month ago, to 2.0. And it's got all kinds of interesting features. On the Mac, there's Finder integration now. So you can actually organize and access all of the documents that you've saved in Keep It using the Finder, which is kind of a nice approach, I think. And there's improved search with a lot of metadata, where you can, for instance, look for all of your articles that you've saved or documents you've saved where you've added highlights, or text documents where you've added a checklist, that sort of thing, which I find that kind of thing reminds me an awful lot of Obsidian and some of the things you can do with data view. And I think that kind of metadata parsing can be really powerful and really Keep It to a new level. There's also something that it's a very small feature, but I find not enough apps allow you to do this, which is manual reordering of the sidebar. Sometimes I don't want my list of documents to be alphabetical, and I don't want them to be in chronological order. Maybe I have a particular project and I want these 4 articles all at the top. And now with Keep It, you can drag those 4 articles up to the top, and they're just there and they stay there. There's also a reader mode for those articles. So you can read through just like very similar to what you would in Safari reading lists. So Keep It's come a long way. I think that there have been times in the past where the app was a little buggy and I had some issues with it. But it's, I think in the last year and a half, it's really stabilized on all the platforms. And these new features in 2.0 are really fantastic. So I intend to spend more time this summer kind of investigating what exactly you can do now with Keep It, and maybe writing about it on Mac Stories at some point. The other thing that I've been doing is exploring what I can do with Safari. And by that, I mean kind of a combination of bookmarks and Safari history. Now, I mentioned Raindrop a little while ago, and I think that that's one of the better options if you want to bookmark web pages and tag them and have ways to sort and filter and search all of that data. And that's not something that I've historically done a lot of, but I think that that's a particularly good solution. What I've been playing with a lot lately is a new app called Surfed. And Surfed...
I've seen this.
Yeah. Surfed came out initially I'd say about a month, maybe a month and a half ago on iOS and iPadOS, which I played with it, but the fact that it wasn't on the Mac was a downside, because I do a lot of surfing on the Mac as well. But now it's available on the Mac as well. And you can think of this as a supercharged Safari history, because what it will do is it will actually monitor all your browsing. It can even, if you want it to, but you don't have to, it's not the default. You can even have it track your private browsing history and save that stuff too. But it tracks and monitors all of your browsing, so you can then search those results and find stuff again. And it's got this, just this last week, they added a feature that's a gallery of what the app calls collections. And collections are essentially saved searches. And there's some neat things you can do. For instance, there was a built-in collection in the gallery that I tried out that's for Amazon. And what it does is it goes through your Safari history and finds all the product pages that you've viewed in the, since the beginning of time. And you can kind of go back through chronologically and find things that you might have been browsing when you're doing some shopping and maybe didn't actually pull the trigger and buy something. But that's, kind of just the tip of the iceberg. Before we started, I did a quick search for iPad OS 16 and another one for Ventura. And I could see all the articles over the last month or so that I have browsed on those topics. And it's a great way, I think, that if we all do it. We accidentally close tabs when we meant to save that link for later in a text editor or, a note-taking app or whatever it happens to be. Now, if you saw this article and you can't find it anymore, you can do a search. And the search field, it supports regex, all kinds of complex queries that can be saved. It's a great way to find your way through your Safari history. It even shows you statistics too, which I think are more for me just a curiosity when I see how many hundreds of web pages I go to in a particular week. It's a little much. The one downside, I would say, and I hope that this is something that the developer considers making at least an option, is that your histories are not merged or synced in any way. I would like to be able to see my history on all of my devices in this app on every version of this app. So if I'm on my Mac, I can maybe have a section for my iPad searches and my iPhone searches. And same thing if I'm on the iPad or the iPhone. Right now, if I want to go find all of my Ventura stories that I've browsed over the past month, for instance, I have to go to first my Mac, then my iPad, then my iPhone, and do it that way. And that's just too much work, I think. It would be nice if there was a way to synchronize those. They don't have to necessarily be merged, although that might be an interesting approach. At least having sections where it was divided like that would be kind of good. So it's a neat app. Federico, I think the last app I'm going to mention in research is an app that has some similarities to GoodLinks. I've talked about GoodLinks a lot in the past, and it's an app that I still use a lot because it has fantastic shortcut support, and it has very good share sheet and Safari extension support, where it makes it very easy and quick to save links and tag them so you can find them later. And I use that every week, really, for things like the Club Mac Stories newsletters. But DoMarks is another one that's kind of caught my eye, and it might be something that I'm going to give a try with the macOS review this year, because DoMarks turns your links into tasks. And some of those stories that I've come across for Ventura, I'd like to maybe drop into DoMarks and create a little list that where I can check them off as I read them, and then move those articles into another process, whether it's in Matter, as you discussed, where I can highlight them and export those highlights into Obsidian or something else, but use that as an inbox for particularly this review and the ability to check them off. I just like the idea of sitting down and saying, all right, well, I've got an hour now. I'm going to read a bunch of these articles I saved and see what I can find from them, and then save them into my research notes for the review this year. So, that's another one that I would check out as well.
DoMarks. That one's new to me.
Yeah,
I gotta check it out.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I mean, it's very much it has similarities to an app like LinkBin too. The one thing about DoMarks that is too bad is that there's not shortcut support there for getting things into or out of it. It's really a share sheet focused app, but for just saving links, that's not a huge downside. And then to get things out, you would then use the share sheet, I think, to get it to Matter or something like that. But yeah, it's an interesting way to approach links.
All right.
All right, Federico, I think that that's a good place to stop for today. I want to thank our two sponsors for this episode. That's Concepts, who will be sponsoring our OS Summer Preview Series all summer long, and SourceGraph. You can find me and Federico over at macstories.net. Federico is at Vitici on Twitter and Instagram. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees, JOHNVOORHWES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.